life is riddled with enigma and oddity. The objective facts are hard to unravel, partly because of his own revisionism. For example, he disowned his own autobiography, but partly because the facts are so messy. Julian was born on the 3rd of July 1971 in Townsville in the state of Queensland in Australia. This is a man who grew up unsettled on a pineapple farm, who spent his childhood exploring tunnels and playing out an Australian version of Tom Sawyer, probably complete with an imaginary white fence. His school was bizarre. He might blame his mother Christine, who thought a conventional education would be a handicap, and so he attended 37 different schools, dropped out of university to concentrate on coding and WikiLeaks, got married at 18 and then divorced. He first met his biological father, an unconventional architect, only when he was 25, but it is John Shipton whom Assange credits with his rebel gene, not the man Brett, whom his mother Christine married when Julian was a year old and who walked out when Julian was 10, or indeed the man she took up with later, whom he called psychotic. Then he got embroiled in a cult that was exposed for sexual abuse and coercion, and escaping from this led to a life on the road with his mother as a teenager fascinated by computers. It was that fascination that did for him. By the early 1990s, he had a reputation as one of the best Australian hackers, offering tips about phreaking, that's making telephone calls without paying, in underground magazines, and discovering access to the US military secret defense system Milnet. If you know the 1983 film War Games, Assange is Matthew Broderick, without the charm. He was charged eventually with 25 counts of hacking, even if the judge concluded that he was motivated by curiosity, not malice. Curiosity and arrogance, because he compared himself on trial to the great Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He also, oddly, brought flowers for the prosecution lawyer. And one of the lawyers pointed out, she doesn't want to date you, Julian. She wants to put you in jail. I don't think he quite got the point. In the event, the court had mercy, and he brought up his son in Melbourne, wrote a book about his hacking experiences, and later found solace in international counterculture groups and parties in Nigeria and Kenya. Indeed, the first WikiLeaks post exposed serious human rights abuse in Kenya, the Kroll Report, and it looked into earlier Kenyan corruption that had been commissioned and then buried by the government, by then already itself mired in filth. This was the match that lit the fire that burnt 30,000 people. WikiLeaks had been devised as an international dead letter drop, but Assange also needed a form and content for WikiLeaks that could make money and gain attention, and that took a few years to get right. WikiLeaks is a story about freedom, free living, but also about the price that involves. It still costs money, and it's still riddled with illusions of grandeur. It's not hard to conclude that Julian Assange lived in some form of fantasy world, and you don't have to be an amateur Freud to see why. He called himself a pig-headed activist intellectual, quite rightly. The hauteur, the naughtiness, the impulsive and reckless behaviour, the oddness, and the brilliance are all there in the beginning. He founded WikiLeaks, initially with Shipton's name, that's his biological father's name, to publish the 2003 guidebook for the detention of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. The 238-page Army manual proved that the US kept prisoners from Red Cross inspectors and applied R21 techniques, that's torture techniques, to make them compliant under interrogation. But it took 4 years before, in 2010, he released the material leaked by Bradley, later Chelsea Manning, the collateral murder footage that he hit the level of fame that he seems to have been hankering after all his life. This showed a US helicopter attacking in Iraq and killing several unarmed civilians, including 2 Reuters journalists. It's this video that defined WikiLeaks. Julian Assange is a brilliant man, a driven man, apparently on the autism spectrum. He said, "Aren't all men?" With what The Guardian called toggling eyes, wary of domesticity, easily angered, reckless with his friends. His collaborators often walked out on him, and about to rocket to astonishing fame, for which arguably he was ill-prepared. So let's look at Bradley Manning, another person caught up in this drama, who did prison time, transitioned gender, and must be covered surely by the same judgment made a few days ago by Judge Ramona Manglona. There was no physical harm done by the WikiLeaks, and the papers released there were not top secret. But the leaks were embarrassing and arguably exposed a serious war crime by the United States. Assange said of the video footage that Manning provided, and that he expertly edited with footnotes and with an accompanying quotation from George Orwell, if those airstrikes are right in acceding to the rules of engagement, then those rules are wrong. Because by the time the footage was aired, the soldiers in the footage had been cleared of all wrongdoing. They had acted, said the US military, within the rules of engagement. But the footage made it very clear, and the voices on the footage made it very clear that this was untrue, it was a lie. And the footage shows, almost certainly, it was a war crime. The video Assange released was called Collateral Evidence and was taken by an Apache helicopter in Iraq on July the 12th, 2007. The helicopter was flying over Baghdad. It seized 2 Iraqis carrying cameras which were misidentified as weapons, and the pilot requests permission to fire. "We have 5 or 6 individuals with AK-47s. Among the victims shot by the US from the helicopter were Saeed Shumar and Namir Noor al-Din, both Reuters journalists. The footage shows their execution, and the voice from the helicopter repeatedly says, 'Keep shooting!' It is unrelenting, and the vocal recording is heartless. A van then appears, and the pilot requests permission to fire again. 'Oh yeah,' says the helicopter voice, 'right through the windshield.' And when they realize there are 2 children in the van, 'Well,' says the voice, 'it's their fault for bringing the kids to battle.' Just then, US soldiers arrive on foot, including Ethan McCord, who has described the scene he saw as a mad horror movie. He locates the 2 wounded children. One of them is 4, one is 10, and carries them to safety. The video was published by Assange on April the 10th, 2010. It was only then that the families and Ethan learnt the truth, hitherto suppressed by the United States of America. Reuters had tried to access the footage, and it had been denied. What WikiLeaks published gave the families and Reuters access to the truth. It was decrypted and published by Assange as an act of transparency. Sensational though it appeared, however, it took time for Assange to realize what he had when he first got it. He examined the footage and the documents in Reykjavik in Iceland in what Assange describes as the bunker, a place where characteristically his paranoia, already in evidence, had him close the curtains day and night. The video was subtitled and carefully edited. The American media was apoplectic. Whoever leaked this is guilty of treason, they said. Indeed, the second WikiLeak of 9,200 documents about activity in Afghanistan the Afghan War Diary, and particularly about Pakistan's direct military links with the Taliban, arguably exposed individuals whose names were not redacted. The Pentagon said WikiLeaks had blood on its hands, though there have never been any reported incidents of any harm done since then because of that information. The New York Times called it an unvarnished and grim picture, and The Guardian agreed there was a public interest in the material being published. The newspapers who published the WikiLeaks agreed not to publish names or sensitive material. But WikiLeaks did not take the same precautions, putting those who helped the US and UK forces in danger. Not so far removed, in fact, from the later botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, from Dominic Raab's sunbathing on the beach in Chania and the abandonment of hundreds of translators, the broken promises, and Afghan troops left even to this day to the mercy of the Taliban. The Guardian, the New York Times, and the Spiegel all printed the Afghan files and confirmed the importance of WikiLeaks. That statement alone, I would argue, despite the indiscretion of the unredacted names, is testimony to the claims later made in court by Assange that he was engaged in journalism. The publication of unredacted names led to tensions in the WikiLeaks organization. Daniel Domscheit-Berg, the WikiLeaks spokesman, was irritated by the promises Assange made to redact the names and his subsequent failure to do so. 76,000 pages were made available, even if 15,000 documents were withheld. This was followed by the Iraq files, 400,000 classified files showing the atrocities of war, the torture of prisoners by the Iraqi security forces, proof of a greater number of civilian deaths, and Iranian support for Iraqi insurgents. In Assange's words, an extraordinary compendium of war. At the time, Assange said the Afghan leak provided victims with a sense of justice and deters future error, except it didn't. And the Pentagon condemned WikiLeaks as a criminal organization. Then there was Cablegate, leaked mostly in November 2010, which completed a barrage of 251,000 cables that began trickling out in February, covering communication from 1966 to 2010, exposing nuclear anxieties and personal and candid, frankly rude critiques by the American officials of foreign governments and individuals. It was probably more embarrassing than it was a security breach, but it was dramatic. And the US said it put human rights activists and dissidents at risk. Hillary Clinton said there's nothing brave in opening up this information on which our security depends. Was this in the public interest or an act of provocation by Assange? Which? From this point, the US were openly calling for Assange's arrest. On the 2nd of September 2011, Australia also pointed out that because an Australian intelligence officer had been explicitly named in one of the cables, a crime was potentially committed in Australia, something that has since been ignored or denied by the Australian Prime Minister and senior Australian politicians who helped to secure Assange's ultimate release. The cables played a role in the 2010 Tunisian revolt or Jasmine Revolution, and therefore in the Arab Spring, which spread to Syria, leading to a civil war there, as well as to the Yemeni crisis and civil war there. And in the summer of 2010, on a trip to Sweden, Julian Assange had consensual but unprotected sex with 2 women. Charges were made and then abandoned. Then they were reinstated in what Assange called a highly irregular legal circus and a honey trap. It was one of a series of unwise moves, but it was not out of character. In 2006, he had described himself as 87% slut and a danger, Achtung! The Guardian had called him a damaged personality with a peacock confidence. But even those most determined to prosecute him look upon the allegations as a grey area. They initially involve a woman called Anna Ardin, who has since written a book detailing her experience and setting out the case against Assange. Anna Ardin was a church deacon, and she says Assange tricked her into unprotected sex. He deliberately ripped a condom and broke her necklace. He was staying in her flat in Sweden, and he continued to stay with her for the next week, sleeping in her bed. She described it as the worst sex ever and violent, and she said that he refused to leave the flat and he continued to make intimate advances towards her. In the course of the week, she learned of another woman, Miss W., who had similar experiences. The second woman claimed that she woke up to find Assange having sex with her. Julian Assange told both women he was too busy to have an HIV test, and it was while they were trying to get a quick test for themselves that they approached the police. Miss W. had been advised, allegedly, by her friends that she could make money out of the story, and Assange's defence team claimed that Anna's accusation was a jealous reaction to finding out that he'd also slept with Miss W. Assange and his lawyer Mark Stevens accused Anna of being a CIA honey trap. The honey trap has been sprung. After what we've seen so far, you can reasonably conclude that this is part of a greater plan, a political stunt. Anna says that as Sweden does not have the same comprehensive extradition treaty with the US that Britain has, ironically, Assange would have been much safer in Sweden than he was in Britain. But the online abuse that she had was so bad that she fled to Spain. And here's the odd thing, the positive comments she still makes about Assange. Julian is definitely not a monster, but he crossed my boundaries. He is in many ways a fantastic person. She also says that Assange refused to shower and left the loo unflushed. He left turds floating in the toilet that consequently smelt. And the flat smelt strongly of unwashed body, of dried-in sweat. An international arrest warrant was issued, a red notice from Interpol, and the British police arrested Assange on the 7th of December 2010. He was imprisoned for a week in London, denying everything and bubbling with paranoia. At this time he met Geoffrey Robinson and lived under house arrest in his attic, explaining that he believed extradition to Sweden would be the first step towards extradition to the US. On February the 25th, a judge ruled in favour of his extradition to Sweden. And after exhausting all remedies, on June the 19th, he fled to the Ecuadorian embassy, and from then on he was supported by Baltasar Razon, a Spanish lawyer who coordinated his defence for free. His supporters believe the sexual abuse story in Sweden is part of an avalanche of mud slung at a freedom fighter in the hope that some of it would stick. As WikiLeaks stands under threat, so does the freedom of expression. It questions investigative journalism, he said from the balcony of the embassy. It is vindictive persecution on press freedom. And he called on the US to drop its witch hunt. Razon explained that over the next few years in the embassy he was skateboarding, he boarded up the windows with cardboard, he endured years without access to sunlight, freedom, and medical care. At the same time, he was visited by celebrities like Pamela Anderson and got married for a second time. But Stella Morris, another lawyer representing him, said the conditions under which he was being held were so oppressive as to drive him to attempt to take his own life. The incarceration in the embassy didn't stop the WikiLeaks activity, however, and the permanent police presence allegedly cost £10 million outside. 2015 saw a new WikiLeaks story about the US listening covertly to French presidents all bugged by the NSA. In a period of 12 years, this story was published in France. In the same year, in August, Sweden abandoned its primary case against him. The following year, Assange publicly backed Trump rather than Clinton. He called Clinton a well-connected, sadistic sociopath. And then there were the copycat WikiLeaks groups, and Assange's links to them and the suspicion that they might be Russian hackers. During the presidential debates between Trump and Hillary Clinton, Trump appealed to Russia to find 30,000 lost emails. And reaching out on the 22nd of June, Assange contacted a hacker called Guccifer 2.0 about a stash of documents from Hillary Clinton to John Podesta. "Send me any new material stolen from the Democratic National Convention here for us to publish. It will have a much higher impact," he said, and the leaks may well have shifted the debate over the election campaign, fingering Clinton as a security liability and undermining Bernie Sanders, the other Democratic primary candidate in the 2016 election. It's not clear, one way or the other, that this is why Clinton lost the election, but it didn't help her. Trump, however, once he took office, turned from saying, "I love WikiLeaks," to saying it was perplexing and deeply troubling. "Call it out for what it is, a non-state hostile intelligence service abetted by state actors like Russia." And Mark Pompeo went after WikiLeaks. "They champion nothing," he said, "but their own celebrity, the destruction of Western values." WikiLeaks made links to 4chan. And again, Russian hackers were suspected, but Assange commanded the front page overhacked emails from the Macron campaign in May 2017. Many of the documents in this batch of documents were demonstrably fake and simply designed to cause trouble. The links with Guccifer and 4chan suggest desperation, therefore, and they spoil Assange's record and reputation. There came at a time when, despite the Swedish courts finally dropping the rape claims, Assange's paranoia was reaching a frenzy point, and with good reason. He was being monitored 24 hours a day, and footage from the embassy was published in Spain. There was no privacy at all. There were even cameras in the loo. In addition, the Ecuadorian government suspended his internet access, and in typical Assange fashion, Assange turned on his only support for violating his fundamental rights. And he filed a case in the Ecuadorian courts, which was, of course, rejected. By 2018, however, the stakes were raised again, and he was officially accused of espionage by the US. In 2019, the new Ecuador President Lenin Moreno, who probably wanted a better relationship with the US, revoked the asylum, leading directly on April the 19th to Assange's arrest and the shocking footage of his being dragged out of the embassy. Jeremy Hunt said, "Julian Assange is no hero. He is hidden from the law for years and years." And the British maintained the stance that their hands were tied by the extradition treaties and the international warrant. But when Julian Assange was finally released, nothing was done to tidy up the details, and Assange actually walked away to the plane seemingly free. So the extradition process was still technically in effect, proving that Britain could have helped at any time if it had wanted to. And in 2020, the first extradition request was considered, but the hearing was in Belmarsh Prison, where Assange was told he faced 175 years if convicted. Surely there are parallels here with the prison hearings of Alexei Navalny. Assange was convicted in November 2019 to 50 weeks in prison, in a British prison, for violating his bail conditions and entering the Ecuadorian embassy. He served more than twice that time. He faced 18 criminal charges from the US, obtaining that is, hacking a password for US Department of Defense computers, receiving and disclosing classified information, breaching the Espionage Act of 1917, and conspiring with Chelsea Manning. Actually, this Espionage Act was an act targeted at American troops, even though Assange is an Australian. And arguably, while he was prosecuted for publishing this material, so too the Times published this material, the Washington Post published it, and the Guardian published it. Shouldn't they have been punished for the same thing? They were not. It was Julian Assange alone who was singled out as a discredit to the United States. On January the 4th, 2021, the UK Supreme Court refused extradition because of Assange's mental health. The US planned to appeal, but the extradition process had exposed the US case as essentially politically motivated and weak. After the government changed, politicians in Australia began campaigning and lobbying for the US to drop the charges. Accordingly, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was the first to meet Assange when he landed in Australia after a brief trip to plead guilty in a plea bargain on the American island territory of Saipan. Nothing is to be served by his ongoing incarceration, said Anthony Albanese. The irony here is that the day Assange was released, the American journalist Evan Gershkovich was taken to court in Russia to be charged behind closed doors with espionage. When contrasted to Evan Gershkovich or Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe and other abuses of legal practice in Russia, Iran and elsewhere, the incarceration of Boris Kargalitsky, the threats to Arundhati Roy by Modi in India, if Assange is now free, then the continued persecution and imprisonment of these people needs to be flagged up. The incarceration of Assange is remarkable, especially when the US judge claims he did no harm as she accepted his plea in Saipan. But we cannot be morally righteous about one injustice and ignore the other. If Gershkovich's incarceration or Navalny's is wrong, then so too is the incarceration and silencing of Assange. More than that, Albanese presents himself as the saviour of freedom in this drama, while David McBride remains in a high-security prison in Australia for exposing the Australian massacre of Afghans, something a royal commission found to have been true. The commission found the military guilty, and yet McBride remains behind bars. Why? Assange was helped almost certainly not only by the Australian Prime Minister, but by Caroline Kennedy, the US ambassador to Australia and JFK's daughter. His plea bargain, however, still leaves a worrying precedent that foreign citizens are not covered by the First Amendment defence. And the Supreme Court in the UK didn't agree with this ruling, but that didn't mean they released Julian Assange from Belmarsh, where he'd been held for 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. He was not a US citizen. He was never charged in the UK. He had not committed an offence in Australia. But on the island in the Pacific in Saipan, the judge said he did no harm. That contradicts all the stuff put out by the US originally, how he put soldiers, civilians, translators, spies at risk. It is the allegation that he was a danger that has dogged the past 14 years of his life, and this question was settled last week in the sleepy island of Saipan when he pleaded guilty to espionage before Judge Ramona Manglona, who said, according to his lawyer Geoffrey Robinson on Radio 4, he had put no one in any physical harm. The documents he released were not top secret. They were available to 2 million American servicemen and to one who was confused about his sexual identity and was the source of the leaks. The morality of the 12 years without freedom for a crime committed outside the US by a non-US citizen is very hard to explain in democratic terms. It's hard to understand how the only way he can have freedom is by willingly consenting to a criminal record, offering to the judge his elocution, his expression of remorse and guilt for a crime that he never committed, and it sets a worrying precedent for press freedom. Indeed, Julian Assange caused embarrassment, and he was probably also directly used, whether he knew it or not, by Russian intelligence. But none of that surely justifies his years of imprisonment in Britain. And it's the response to Assange that is so worrying, because it sets a precedent for state suppression of journalism. And his plea bargain justifies the US suppression of dissent, criticism, and questioning. It raises questions about what can legitimately be reported about Ukraine and Gaza. Rather than opening up debate, in other words, the WikiLeaks saga has potentially